how do you know if you haven't seen one, if you would like it or not like it?
Right.
And so the thing is, you have to see one and say, okay, I don't like that.
What kind of man does Chuck Norris refuse to work with? After decades of silence, the answer is finally here. Chuck Norris, martial arts legend, action movie icon, and symbol of quiet strength, has always let his actions speak louder than words. But even a man of honor has his limits. And now, for the first time, he's naming the 5 actors who cross those lines. This isn't about ego, it's about principles. Get ready, because the names on this list will shock you. Jean-Claude Van Damme. When you show power, you're not really living it. And Chuck Norris knew the difference between them all. While most actors were after quick fame and the spotlight, Chuck was shaped by real fights, long training sessions, and the idea that martial arts wasn't about how good you look, but how good you are, even when no one is looking. A lot of fans thought Chuck and Jean-Claude would be great together when Jean-Claude Van Damme came on the scene with his flashy kicks and movie star swagger. Both do martial arts, the 2 movie stars. Both are world famous, but Chuck saw something that no one else did. Jean-Claude had guts, feeling sure, maybe too sure of themselves. When he got to Hollywood, he came in like a storm, loud and fast, with stunts and one-liners to match. His fame came from his strength, mirrors, and speed. It worked. He became famous very quickly after films like Bloodsport and Kickboxer. But that attention also came with a growing image for being cocky. That's where Chuck made his stand. They were never bad guys on TV, but what happens behind the scenes? There was stress. And the moment when everything became clear was at a famous party that Sylvester Stallone threw. There were the toughest and most respected action stars from the 1980s and 1990s at this party. It wasn't just any party. Stan Lee, Bruce Willis, of course, Chuck Norris. Van Damme walked in like he was the only one there. It's said that he made a scene, too loudly bragged, truly and figuratively stepped into Chuck's space. What about Chuck? He wasn't mean. There was no yelling. He did nothing but stare, not out of fear, not when you're mad, but with a look that says, "I know you for who you are." After that night, Chuck made a choice that was quiet but firm. He would never work with Van Damme. Not in a movie. Not in a small role. You can't even train with them because Chuck didn't care about skill. It had to do with character. For Chuck, martial arts were a means to an end, a way of life. In this case, it meant respect, patience, and control. Even though Van Damme was very good, he stood for the opposite. They have flashy moves, short tempers, and care more about fame than theory. Van Damme trained in front of a mirror, while Chuck practiced alone. Van Damme posed for the camera instead of bowing before the fight like Chuck did. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a fight over ideas. Chuck didn't say it out loud, but it was clear from what he did. He turned down many parts over the years that could have put them together. Fans asked for it over and over. The studios worked hard to make it happen. But Chuck didn't give up. That might be why his quiet is so strong. He didn't need to talk badly about Van Damme in public. A tell-all book wasn't what he did. He let the fact that he wasn't there say everything. They have never shared a movie until now. They've never been in a fight scene together. And that quiet? It talks stronger than words. It's simple to believe that every martial artist is the same. That having a black belt means you're brave. That training means being disciplined. But Chuck Norris knew I was lying. He knew that being good at martial arts wasn't just about what you do, but also about how you act when no one is looking. He did not see a warrior in Jean-Claude when he looked at him. Someone put on a show. The press made up lies. Fans argued for hours online. A few people even said Chuck was angry. But his work, record, and life show that he never used the word. Being honest was. He left not because he was afraid of the fight, but because some fights aren't worth getting into. Jean-Claude became famous in the end. He was in the news, the fronts of magazines, the movie deals. But Chuck? He got the gift. Not based on noise, but on regularity. How to say no when it matters. When ideals are tested in a world that tries to change them all the time. 2 men, 2 ways. 1 picked the crowd. The code was picked by someone else. Even though Chuck Norris may not have publicly called out Jean-Claude Van Damme, he was quietly taken off the list for good. That fight was crazy, but what happened next was even crazier. The next person on Chuck Norris's blacklist not only didn't agree with his values, but he also broke every rule of respect, humility, and discipline that Chuck had ever stood for. Someone who not only broke the rules, but also behaved like they were the rules. Next up is the martial artist who thought no one could hurt him until he met the man who never blinks and learnt the hard way what happens when pride meets a man who never blinks. Steven Seagal. If there's one thing Chuck Norris never allowed, it's ego without honor. And no name sparked that response more than Steven Seagal. Jean-Claude Van Damme and Chuck got into a fight over performance, but Seagal went even further. He not only thought he was the best, but he also acted like everyone else was less important than him. That wasn't just annoying for a man like Chuck. It couldn't happen. Chuck was already a well-known name in martial arts and movies by the time Seagal became famous in the late 1980s and early 1990s. However, Seagal added something very different to the scene. He wasn't as flashy as Van Damme. He was chilly, figured out. He used smooth, quick takedowns and joint locks that come from judo to build his style. It didn't matter that it didn't look like Chuck's striking-based form. It was the way Seagal acted that was wrong. Stories from movie sets came in quickly. Stunt people said Seagal hurt them because he wouldn't pull his moves. His co-stars talked behind his back about how controlling, rude, and even mean he was. Martial artists, real ones, started noticing something deeper. Behind those moves that were good for the camera was someone who didn't follow the fighting code. Chuck knew what was going on. He stood back and watched. He saw how Seagal used the craft as a way to gain power, instead of as a way to improve. Chuck thought that as you get older, you should become less proud. Seagal thought that people should kneel more when they were higher up, and that's where their paths left off. Fans have always wondered why Chuck and Seagal never worked together. Putting 2 famous martial artists in the same movie seemed like a very good idea. But Chuck always stayed away. He never used Seagal's name in interviews, but if you paid attention, you could hear the meaning. People often used this simple quote from him: "Real fighters don't talk down to other people." He lived that. Even when he became famous, Chuck stayed humble, gave credit where credit was due, and helped others. On the other hand, Seagal was known for making fun of other stars, even Bruce Lee. That made me angry, because Bruce wasn't just Chuck's co-star, he knew me, a guide. In the world of martial arts, Chuck looked up to this man more than anyone else. That's why Seagal's comment that Bruce couldn't fight for real wasn't just a hot take. It was a straight attack on what Chuck stood for. What about Chuck? He didn't reply with a quote or a call-out. He replied by keeping his distance. Complete and utter quiet. A lot of people in Hollywood started to notice too. Directors should not have suggested that they be paired together. Producers didn't try to get people to work together. And stunt directors made jokes that Chuck would rather retire than fight someone who was rude to everyone in the business. Chuck didn't make a fuss. He just chose what to do. In the end, everyone in the martial arts world chose a side, not by yelling, but by watching. While Chuck was praised by veterans, martial arts teachers, and groups for promoting the real values of the sport, Seagal was at the center of controversy after controversy. People said that his methods wouldn't work in a life battle. His past was called into question. He was so cocky that it made the news more often than his work. It didn't hurt more that Seagal had friends. It was that he used martial arts to boost his pride. Chuck used it to build character his whole life, not the other way around. That's why they were so far apart. It's not just skill, not just fame, but the heart is behind the skill. Chuck's quiet turn-down of Seagal wasn't a fight. It taught me that you shouldn't respect everyone with a black belt, that not all people who act like warriors really are warriors. And sometimes the best thing to do is not fight, but walk away. When Seagal's business took a hit and he got into more and more trouble, Chuck didn't say a word. There was no party. Don't say, "I told you so." He looked at Van Damme with the same calm look. A line of silence that you don't cross. What do you do when the fight isn't even about martial arts? If Chuck is in a room with someone whose views are different from his own, what does that mean? It could be anywhere in the world. Next is the star whose loud voice, public rants, and political chaos made Chuck back off even more. They don't fight because of kicks or punches, but because of ideals that are stronger than blows. Alec Baldwin. Some fights don't start with arms. They start with what they think. One of the biggest disconnects in Chuck Norris's long career had nothing to do with martial arts, action movies, or fight routines. Values were at the center of it all. The ones that make you choose who you want to stand with, how you live, and what you stand for. Now comes Alec Baldwin. Baldwin talked a lot. Sharp. There is a firecracker in every conversation. He didn't just do things, he also responded to them, often without thinking, often in public, and often without any filters. Because of that, he became famous and controversial. Chuck, on the other hand, saw it as a red flag. Because Baldwin, behind the tough guy parts and sarcastic humor, stood for something Chuck had spent decades trying to avoid. Personality behind division. Chuck wasn't like the other guys, a former soldier, a religious person. This man was very patriotic, and it showed in his work, his causes, and even the jobs he chose. He did more than just say he supported the troops. He spent time with soldiers, gave money to veteran groups, and wrote freely about faith and honor. He didn't need a stage to show who he was. His life told a lot about him. That's where the gap got really big. Baldwin, on the other hand, was famous for criticizing everything Chuck stood for. Baldwin didn't hold back when he had something to say, whether it was making fun of faith or the military. They were always there. He cooked up presidents. He made fun of conservative beliefs. He also went after the person, not the policy, when he didn't like something. It wasn't a debate, it was a demolition. Several people who know them say that the tension between them finally broke at a charity event in Los Angeles. The event was to honor heroes and raise money for soldiers who have been hurt in battle. Chuck was asked to come as a special guest. Baldwin showed up to host the show. An event that should have brought people together turned into a cold and awkward standoff. According to the story, Baldwin said something rude about military society behind closed doors that other people could hear. Chuck did not answer. He didn't hit. He did nothing but watch and then turned away. The chill hit the people around them right away. There was nothing going on, but there wasn't a need for it. That quiet? It said a lot more than words. Later, Chuck was asked in an interview about stars he couldn't work with. He did not say who it was, but he said, "I don't agree with some people because of their skills, but because of how they treat others and what they stand for." Fans knew who he was talking about. Baldwin kept doing what he did best, which was loud rants, late-night shows, and making fun of politics. Chuck stayed away from the trouble. But the cue was already there. Chuck doesn't waste time fighting with people who try to destroy what he's worked so hard to build. Baldwin was more than just a different person. He had a lot of different ideas. Baldwin saw rules, while Chuck saw discipline. When Chuck thought of honor, Baldwin thought of blind loyalty. It didn't matter who was right, because they lived so far away. Being in the same room felt like a mistake. Chuck never talked to Baldwin in public. He didn't say anything. He didn't tweet anything. He didn't make things worse. Because Chuck thinks that being quiet is the best way to end a conversation without starting a fight, he didn't need to fight Baldwin. He should have just stepped away and never come back. It wasn't about right or left. It had to do with respect. And Chuck thought Baldwin had none for the things that were most important: faith, work, and other people's worth. Disagreeing is not the same as putting someone down. Chuck thinks that you can disagree with ideas without making fun of the people who came up with them. Baldwin never seemed to make that point. But if you thought Baldwin tried Chuck's patience, wait until you meet the next name on this list. This one wasn't a star with politics. He was chaos wrapped in youth, fire, and fame. A rising star actor who hurt the things Chuck built his life on. Not because of theory, but because they weren't careful. What happened next made Chuck leave the set without looking back. Shia LaBeouf. There is a spirit in Hollywood that either makes things shine or breaks people down. Shia LaBeouf was one of the few people who really showed that wild, uncertain spark. Shia wasn't just an actor. He was a storm in everything from Transformers to indie pictures and hit performance pieces. Chuck Norris, on the other hand, saw disrespect instead of rebellion in his fans. Shia became well-known very quickly and loudly. He was young, good at what he did, and didn't care about following the rules. Directors liked how intense he was. Tabloids wrote about his breakdowns. He wasn't smooth like the stars before him. He was honest, messy, and proud of it. And that drew people to him for a while. It made him careless, though. Chuck had seen a lot of up-and-coming stars before. Some people liked the grind. Some people skipped it completely. But thanks was what set them apart. Chuck thought that even the best artists had to keep their feet on the ground and be humble. That wasn't something Shia seemed to believe in. He was determined to break the rules, write new scripts, and do things his own way, even if it meant disrespecting heroes. On a movie set, everything went wrong at once. Experienced people worked with young people on a project that mixed order and chaos. Chuck decided to have a small part in a movie about martial arts because the story showed respect for the art. Structure, training, and honor, everything Chuck stood for, were used to build it. Shia took the lead, and from the start, he brought that same wildfire with him. To begin with, Chuck was calm. He let Shia get into a groove. But that rhythm changed into improvisation very quickly, which went against everything the movie was about. Scenes with martial arts turned into jokes. Conversations that were supposed to show respect turned into jabs that weren't in the script. The last straw was when Shia, half laughing, walked away from the scene they were blocking during a practice. He is said to have said, "This feels so old school." That might have seemed like a harmless statement to most people, but for Chuck, it was the worst offense possible. Old school didn't mean out of date. It meant based on ideals. It meant working long hours. The black belts gained. The bumps that were taken in the quiet. Someone who made fun of that wasn't just making fun of a fighting style. They were making fun of a life. Chuck wasn't upset. He didn't say why. He just left in peace. There was no news, not a news release, no shade for everyone. He left the set and didn't come back. Because that moment wasn't about Chuck's ego, it was about what was right. You don't have to shout over some parts. Sometimes you can't get a second chance. Some people worked behind the scenes to make things better. They asked Chuck to think again. They told him it wasn't about them. That was the point, though. It was personal. Chuck didn't mind if someone was crazy. Neither incidents from the past nor internet antics interested him. Honor was important to him, and he went away when it did. Chuck didn't learn martial arts to control other people. He learned it to control himself. He saw the opposite in Shia, a man who was driven by impulse and could go from being brilliant to being a disaster without any control to hold him down. And that kind of chaos didn't fit with Chuck Norris, no matter how good they were. This wasn't about two actors having a fight on set. It was about a man who left because someone crossed a cue. This line had nothing to do with fame or fighting style. It was about thanks, honor, and leaving a memory. Chuck is okay with chaos. It's like he won't shake hands with it. That moment was crazy, but what happened next was even crazier. The last name on Chuck's secret watch list isn't even a person. It's something bigger. This is everything that has ever made Chuck say no in quiet. Next, we'll talk about the symbol of everything that's wrong with current Hollywood and the reason Chuck finally gave up. The symbol. Not every name on Chuck Norris's list of people to avoid is well known. You can't find every enemy on IMDb because Chuck doesn't always stand against a single person. Sometimes it's a habit. There's a loud, slick, and empty attitude that's making its way into Hollywood. When someone acts like they are a fake martial artist, trick double, or egotistical opportunist, Chuck thinks they are the most dangerous. This last actor has more than one face, several. A mix of the things Chuck has quietly left behind over and over again. Someone who comes to a shoot with a group, claims to be a black belt, but can't even keep a proper stance. Not the kind that learns words by heart. Who fights for the camera but doesn't really believe he is a warrior. For Chuck, martial arts have always been important, not as a show, but as a way of life. A road made by tears, bumps, early starts, and late nights. So he doesn't argue when someone turns that into a flashy highlight reel with no real work or effort. He just takes a step back. Chuck has made it clear in his works and interviews that martial arts is about telling the truth. Being strong isn't something you should fake. Step by step, it's about getting stronger. But Hollywood doesn't always like telling the truth. It gives points for things that look good. What quickly sells? What gets through on the trailer, even if it's against the rules behind the scenes? Chuck has said no more often than yes over the years. Not because he's mean, not because he won't give up, but because he knows what happens when you mix up business and mastery. You miss the point. Once that's gone, all you can do is kick for claps. He has turned down parts that would have made a lot of money at the box office. He has turned down plots that used martial arts as a gag rather than a real skill. As a child, he saw young stars act out fight scenes for fun, stare at their trainers, or ask someone else to do their moves. Chuck always chose to walk in peace. No news stories, not a story. He wouldn't sign yet another page. The fifth actor in this figure of speech is the person who doesn't respect the road and doesn't even know it. People who believe that martial arts isn't about getting better, but about making it to the next level. Chuck doesn't dislike those people. He doesn't want them to be in his world. In his articles, he's talked about how the business has changed and how too many films care more about camera angles than characters. He has been told that everything built on top of a cracked base will fall. That's why he checks his name a lot. He knows that when you stand with someone, you support what they believe in. Also, Chuck doesn't agree with shortcuts. Not many people know this last name. It has to do with behavior. The character who doesn't want to be named shows up without preparing. That boss who says, "We'll fix it in post." The boss who just wants a fight scene and not what it means. These people don't fight with Chuck. They never get the chance. Because Chuck leaves when he feels like the energy is off, or when the code is missing. Chuck thinks that martial arts is holy. You don't lie about it. You don't flash it. You live it. You can't wear the belt if you're not ready to carry that weight, or show everyone the screen. That's why his silence is more important than any conversation. But a lot of names were never said because of this. Their silence was louder than a punch, due to the fact that Chuck only worked with people who deserved it. His job was never to meet everyone. Why he kept silent for decades. There have been times when Chuck Norris has had to raise his voice to be heard. Chuck has always been quieter than most people when it comes to calling out celebrities, online fights, and interviews that go viral. Being quiet was never a sign of weakness. It was tough. It was his shield for decades, a way for him to set limits without making a fuss. Because Chuck didn't think it was worth his time to deal with people who didn't follow the rules. He was taught discipline, built up through service, and formed by the rough edges of real battle and real results. He didn't swing back when someone crossed the queue. They would never stand next to him again. That's all he did. That's why this list is so unique. Chuck hasn't fought these 5 people, whether they are real or just ideas. They remind him of the lines he wouldn't cross, not because of quirks or drama behind the scenes, but because they all broke something much deeper: respect, humility, and honor. Jean-Claude Van Damme brought his ego to a fight where it didn't belong. His desire to impress was stronger than his ability to show respect. For Chuck, that wasn't a difference in art. That was a philosophical wall that couldn't be climbed. Steven Seagal wasn't just arrogant. He weaponized his superiority. He dismissed others, mocked legends, and carried himself as if martial arts were something to conquer, not live by. Chuck didn't need to compete with that. He just refused to entertain it. Alec Baldwin represented the clash of belief systems. It wasn't about kicks or punches. It was about how you treat the things you claim to stand for. Baldwin's approach was loud, combative, and often personal. For Chuck, it wasn't politics. It was poison. Shia LaBeouf, though younger and talented, crossed a line Chuck never forgives: disrespect. When Shia mocked the discipline of martial arts, even jokingly, he broke the unspoken agreement that Chuck holds above all: respect the path, or get off it. And then there's the symbol, the 5th name with no face, a warning to the business, a message to anyone who sees martial arts as a business instead of mastery. The fake belts, the ego-driven methods, the actors who want the glory without the grind. Chuck sees them all, and every time, his reaction is the same: silence. Not because he can't speak, but because some people don't deserve the answer. For over 50 years, Chuck Norris has lived by the same values, on and off the screen: integrity, respect, stick to it. And most of all, he was loyal to the code that gave his life meaning. He's never tried to be popular, never got into fights to stay alive. His reputation wasn't based on fights. It was built on truth. Now that time has passed and stories are no longer as strong, Chuck has finally decided to speak out, not to attack, but to explain, to make it clear that the years he has been quiet were not a mistake. He did it to keep what was important to him safe. Because not everyone deserves to share the frame in his world, and some names, no matter how big, don't fit next to his. The word hate is strong. It doesn't fit right. Chuck doesn't dislike these guys. He just won't let them share space with him. Because when you show up for someone, you share your stage. And Chuck's position has always been sacred. The truth is, Chuck doesn't ban people because they challenged him. He does it because they disrespected something bigger than both of them. The spirit of martial arts, the weight of the belt, and the quiet honor of going away with your values intact. It wasn't about drama in the end. It had to do with discipline. And Chuck's silence? That was never empty. There was always a lot of meaning, purpose, and limits in it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Click on the next video popping up on your screen for more amazing content.